am so pleased to welcome Martin Wood to lecture for us this evening about Nancy Lancaster's own houses and gardens. I know many of you in the audience have already seen his wonderful book, Nancy Lancaster, English Country House Style. It was in the window of almost every independent bookshop. It was also reviewed by The Times and on the coffee table of almost every designer whose house I visited this year. Mr. Wood is a textile and garden designer as well as an interior designer. He has written extensively on garden design and is co-author of Gertrude Jekyll at Munston Wood with Judith Tankard, and is the editor of The Unknown Gertrude Jekyll, published by Francis Lincoln this past May. He lectures extensively in England and the United States on garden design and design history. He led an exclusive and successful travel program to Nancy Lancaster's properties for the Institute of Classical Architecture, and hopefully will manage another trip soon. Currently, he is working on a new monograph on John Fowler, a designer who is responsible for transforming some of Britain's most historic interiors and co-founded Colefax and Fowler with the interior designer Lady Sybil Colefax. I look forward to the book's publication in the spring, and I hope we can persuade Martin to come back and lecture for us next fall here in Boston in a repeat performance. I am so pleased that he was able to take time off from his busy schedule to travel around the States for Royal Oak and for his publisher the past 2 weeks. And I've heard this lecture more than once, and I can tell you that we're in for a treat, and it's never boring. So you can pass on to your friends to log on and listen to it. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you very much. This is my Cecil Beaton moment. Lights, action, camera, like magic. Voila. Okay. No, there we are. Right. Welcome. My lecture tonight is about Nancy Lancaster and what is generally termed the English style, or the English country house style. And this sketch is actually by Sir Cecil Beaton, and I'm afraid modesty precludes me from revealing the exact year it was done, because it happens to be the year I was born. But anyway, we'll get over that. Nancy is regarded as the greatest influence on interior decoration and garden design in the latter half of the 20th century. And that is a very bold statement to make, but I hope at the end of this hour-long talk you will agree that it's right. And her name is synonymous with what is known as the English style. Well, what is the English style? Well, the English style, as one observer has noted, is a subtle amalgam, at heart a cool and eclectic view of the 17th and 18th centuries. And what the English style sought to do was to recreate an image of the past that was, in essence, an illusion. And this is very much in the English tradition. The English don't like precision. That's why we have the messiest constitution in the world, but it works. That's the English way of doing things. The English are actually a rather anarchic people. But Nancy wasn't English. She wasn't American. She was a Virginian. And she was very... I thought I'd say that to a room full of Yankees, you know. Anyway, Nancy was a Virginian, and she was actually born at Mirador, her grandfather's house, which is 18 miles from Charlottesville. And she was born there in a cottage on the 10th of September 1897. And although Chili Langhorne might have appeared the very epitome of a southern gentleman, his money was so new that had he given you a dollar bill, you would have ended up with green ink stains on your fingers. He only bought the house in June of 1892, so it was all a bit of a sham, really. This is Mirador. And Nancy had a very romantic view of Virginia, and it was based on what I call reactionary nostalgia. And reactionary nostalgia was a huge driving force in the United Kingdom, and also here in the United States in that period, and in a way, certainly in England, it remains so. Now, Nancy, Chili Langhorne had a large family. He had 8 children, and Nancy had 4 aunts. And Nancy always dreamt that one day she would own Mirador, but with such a large family, it never looked as though she would ever get to own it. But Sometimes if you want something and wish it, it comes true. And in 1922, her aunt, Phyllis Brand, sold her Mirador. Now, you would have thought that, in a way, thinking of reactionary nostalgia, Nancy would have wanted to have keep Mirador as it was, not a bit of it. And she instituted a programme of modernisation and improvements. And she was really quite radical. And to do this, she needed architectural help. So she turned to a man called William Delano of the New York firm of architects Delano and Aldridge. And Billy Delano became a great friend of Nancy's, and he had been a friend of Phyllis Brand's. And to Delano, Nancy was one of the most attractive women I have ever known, a dreamer of great dreams and being bountifully provided with funds by her husband, able to realise them. I'm rather glad he added that last little bit, because Nancy could spend money like water. And to Billy Delano, Mirador was a rather ill-planned and ramshackle house. So they set about improving it and modernising it. And one of the things they did to start off with was incorporate the back porch into the house. But this made the staircase hall disproportionately large. So they came up with a rather radical solution, and that was to hollow out the middle of the house and create a new sweeping staircase, which you see here. And to do this, it all sounds relatively simple, but actually what they did was they cut the house in half, added about 6 feet to its width, and sewed it back together again. So the whole house was re-roofed, the back flues in the back rooms, the chimneys were all moved. This was a radical makeover. It wasn't just cosmetic. And naturally, all the aunts got involved in renovating Mirador, or as I say, they stuck their oars in. And Irene Gibson, the Gibson girl, she said, "You can't touch the front door stoop. That's where Dan courted me." And Nancy Astor wouldn't hear that the old smokehouse was moved, for there she had played as a child. I think she was 13 when Chile bought the house. And Phyllis Brand still thought she had a praetorial interest in it. So it was a bit of a problem. But renovate it she did. And Nancy's main influence was, aside from Old Virginia, that sort of faded elegance of the plantation house, the gone with the wind bit, she was hugely influenced by a man called Ogden Codman. And Ogden Codman was a Bostonian by birth, and he built himself a magnificent house in New York called 7 East 96th Street. He was a gentleman architect. And of course, he is famous today for his book, The Decoration of Houses, published in 1897 with the novelist Edith Wharton. And Nancy was able to rent Ogden Codman's townhouse for about 4 or 5 years in the 1920s. And it was a huge influence on her. But here you see the old parlour at Mirador. And Nancy scoured the neighbourhood for chintzes, old bits of chintz, and none of them matched. And later she got the same effect by soaking new fabric in tea. And it was all about patina, bashing things around, degranding. Some rooms she didn't really change at all, and this is a library at Mirador, which Phyllis Brand's mother-in-law had paid to be panelled in tulip wood poplar, and the panelling was possibly designed for the room by Delano. But Nancy left it as it was. She wanted it to be an antidote to the searing heat of summer. She wanted this sort of cool, dark room. And all she did was new upholstery. She reupholstered some chairs, the blue Queen Anne chairs that you see. But in concept and composition, this is a very American room. It is not, speaking as an Englishman, it is not something I recognise as an English library. It's a very American room. And they didn't just stop at renovating the house. They turned their attention to the garden. And the arches that you see here frame a view to the Blue Ridge Mountains, the famous Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And they were copied from Mount Vernon, Washington's old house. And Nancy was a great gardener, and she's almost as famous for her gardens as her rooms. And she said, towards the end of her life, she said, "The one thing I'm going to do is never have a garden when I grow up," because the aunts had all had gardens. And she said, "They made me pick the nasturtiums and the pansies every day, and I hated it." But the love of gardening is a seed that once sown is very difficult to eradicate. And she was forced to concede at the end of her life, "I've done nothing but have gardens." But as she pointed out, the fun of a garden, or the point of a garden, is not so much telling a man plant that plant there or somewhere else or whatever. It's actually doing it yourself. It's getting your hands dirty. Or as Nancy said with characteristic wit, getting down flat down on your stomach and weeding with your teeth. Well, I've been a gardener all my life and I can't say I've ever weeded with my teeth, but there's time yet. Anyway, the inspiration for the garden at Mirador came from a house on the James River called Brandon. And Nancy went there and she wrote about it and she said, and I quote, she said, "I thought it was frightfully romantic." She said, "And I remember a great muddy ocean at the end of a wide grass walk and huge pecan trees each side of the walk, and the wisteria and the trumpet vines had grown right to the top of the trees. I thought that the most romantic thing." Well, she didn't have the mighty James River at the bottom of the garden, but she had the mountains. So she used the mountains. And as Delano remarked, to wake each morning and look up at the Blue Ridge Mountains, which seem only a stone's throw away and change colour and form from hour to hour, is an inspiration. Now, Nancy is as famous for her gardens, her interiors, and she's also famous for marrying well. It's rather an art form, I always feel. And says he that's unmarried. Her first husband was a man called Henry Field of the Chicago department. He was a grandson of the Chicago department store owner Marshall Field. And when I was in Chicago last week, I got out of the taxi and was delighted to see the hotel was opposite Marshall Field's. And then I was rather less delighted to see that it's now a Macy's, but never mind. So, when I made that point in Chicago, I got hissed, and I felt like saying, well, it could have been worse. It could have been a Walmart. Anyway, Henry Field and Nancy were married in February 1917, and tragedy, I'm afraid, soon struck, and Henry Field died on the 8th of July 1917. And this caused Nancy to have a nervous breakdown, and for years Nancy was plagued by bouts of depression. And for some unknown reason, which I cannot explain, depression is often the handmaiden of creativity. And to use a quote from the Book of Common Prayer, "The Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away." And what the Lord gives is the gift of creativity, but what he takes away is peace of mind. And Nancy was tormented by depression, really, for the rest of her life. But anyway, in May 1920, she was fortunate enough to marry Ronald Tree. And Ronald Tree was Henry Field's cousin, and he was the heir to the Tree fortune. And the Trees had owned the other half of Chicago that the Fields didn't own, which was rather handy. And as heir to the Tree fortune, his grandfather was Judge Lambert Tree. Judge Lambert Tree had wanted him to have a career in public life. But unfortunately, Ronnie had been brought up in Warwickshire, and he spoke with a plummy English accent, even worse than mine. And there was no way here in America he could get elected to anything, not even the post of dog catcher. And so he gave up and decided to try his luck in England. So they moved to England. And in 1926-7, he was offered the joint mastership of the Pytchley Hunt. He accepted with delight. At first, they rented a house called Cottesbrook Hall, which has Adam decoration, and they very nearly bought it. But Nancy got cold feet and said no, she didn't want it. So then they took a 10-year repairing lease on a house called Kelmarsh Hall. And Kelmarsh Hall was the ideal house for them. It was a Palladian house, and it had been built in 1728 for William Hambrit by James Gibbs. And James Gibbs, the Scottish architect James Gibbs, is famous today for his two London churches, St Mary le Strand and St Martin's in the Field, the church in Trafalgar Square. And he'd studied in Rome under Carlo Fontana, and Fontana was himself a pupil of Bernini, who added the colonnades to St Peter's in 1656. And so, in a way, Gibbs was more influenced by the Baroque than he was by the work of Andrea Palladio. But nevertheless, Kelmarsh is... Sorry? There you go. Thank you. And so it's rather difficult. I see it at a bleak angle. Anyway, let us continue. And he was much taken with Palladian houses. And again, when they took took a 10-year repairing lease on Kelmarsh. They needed architectural advice to help with the renovations. But this time, they turned to Paul Phipps. And Paul Phipps was Nancy's uncle, the father of the comedian Joyce Grenfell. And he had been a pupil of Sir Edwin Lutyens. When they first visited Kelmarsh, the hall that you see here, the Great Hall, had been painted dark bottle green, and the walls had been covered with military impedimenta. And at some point, Nancy must have been a guest at a house called Rushbrook Hall, the home of Anne, Lady Islington, in Bury St Edmunds, now sadly demolished. And she had seen there the hall at Rushbrook and wanted to copy the colour, which was a soft apricot pink, a very light terracotta. So she sent her painter down to Rushbrook, Mr. Kick, and Mr. Kick returned with 2 samples, one the colour they wanted to achieve, and one the colour of brown paper. They painted the room the colour of brown paper. And to this composition, they added two sets of seating furniture. The hall has 2 fireplaces in different colours and textures and different shapes. And they used, in the centre of the room, they used a Georgian pillar desk to split the room in half. And notice on the floor a plain beige-coloured carpet in what Nancy called dead mouse. Usually I'm asked what colour is dead mouse, and so the obvious thing is to go and catch a mouse. Anyway, leading off the Great Hall is the Saloon, which Nancy painted a colour she called the soul of blue. It's sort of like a deep, not a deep sort of navy blue or anything like that. It's sort of like a bluey green with a hint of grey in it. A very unusual colour. And the curtains that you see here in this slide were designed for Nancy by a lady called Mrs. Bethel, Ethel Bethel. Try saying that when you've had a few. Anyway, Mrs. Bethel had a decorating business called Eldon at 84 Duke Street, what is now the Marriott Hotel. And during the period, there were a number of famous lady decorators, many of whom you will have heard of. Dolly Mann was one, Sybil Colefax was another, perhaps slightly later. Ciri Morn, of course, the wife of Somerset Maugham, the novelist, and, of course, your own Elsie de Wolfe. But Mrs. Bethel is a rather obscure figure, and she'd gone into business with a lady called Alice Dryden, hence the name Eldon, in about 1904. And Alice Dryden's father, Sir John, was a great friend of Margaret Jordan, who was an early historian on interior decoration. And that is probably where most of Mrs. Bethel's historical knowledge emanated from. But the one thing I wanted to say about Mrs. Bethel was that she created a sort of restrained look, which has been really greatly underestimated and underappreciated. But Nancy Lancaster and John Fowler both thought that she was by far the best decorator I've ever known, and that is high praise from such figures. Now, I only know of 2 rooms that I can directly say are Mrs. Bethel's, and this is one of them. This is the exhibition bedroom at Kelmarsh, which was done for the Decorators' Exhibition at Olympia in 1927. And Nancy just bought the room, lock, stock and barrel. And she installed it over an extension to the library, which has since it was demolished in the 1950s. Unfortunately, I wish this slide was in colour. So I'm afraid you must use your imaginations to do a little bit of painting. And the bed was of old rose apricot brocade, allied to curtains of ivory silk taffeta with a pelmet of panels, each painted with flowers, and the whole was trimmed with old rose. The walls that you see are tulip green, and on the floor is a dead mouse carpet. And this was such a successful composition that Nancy copied it at Queen Anne's Gate and after the war at Haseley Court. But these bedrooms show, in a way, that Mrs. Bethel had a genius for arranging damasks and brocades and painted and embroidered materials and to create stylish bed hangings. And she used a very narrow range of fabrics and tones, but she created interiors that were really quite sophisticated. Now, Nancy wasn't just influenced by the past, she was also influenced by the present. And this is very much the present, although it might not appear so. This was Nancy's bedroom, and the walls were covered with white silk, which she bought from a lady at Versailles, who had been recommended to her by Mrs. Cole Porter. She had a white carpet down. The bed hangings were in white damask with silver trim, and this was very much at the cutting edge of fashionable taste. And lady decorators were rather a formidable lot. And as one observer has dryly noted, from necessity as much as inclination, they developed qualities of toughness that would have embarrassed Attila. And speaking from experience, not much changes, I'm afraid. Anyway, he was actually thinking of Ciri Morn, the wife of Somerset Maugham, who was rather a dragon. And Ciri Morn is famous for her white room. And that white room was created in 1926, 1927, something like that. And it was featured in Harper's Bazaar in October 1929. But old Ciri knew a thing or two about marketing. And by 1936, it had become a red and white room. But white rooms, what we think of today as a white room, all that sort of, really starch white, that wasn't what Ciri created. Ciri created a room that was full of white, beige, creams, those sort of tones, which built up the colour. But the white room was not a new thing. It can be traced back to at least the arts and crafts movement. And Philip Webb had created a white drawing room, actually, at Clouds for the Wyndhams. And you will hear more of the Wyndhams in a moment. In 1933, Ronnie's mother died and she left him some money. And Ronnie and Nancy were inveterate lookers of houses. And a man called Colonel Reginald Cooper, who was a friend of Vita Sackville West and rather a doyen of houses himself, recommended that they go to see a house in Oxfordshire called Ditchley Park. I just want to read you a little bit about Ditchley Park. The countryside we passed through on the way did not especially appeal to us. And it was not until we reached the main Oxford-Chipping Norton Road at Kidlington and turned down the little lane leading to Ditchley marked private that our expectations began to rise. I remember the hedge on either side of the road being full of wild roses and honeysuckle and the smell of new-mown hay. A few minutes later we came out of the lane and before us was a great double avenue of beech trees leading up to the gate lodge. I remember that first sight of it. We marvelled at it. Once through the gates, we found ourselves in a heavily wooded park where deer, many of them white, were grazing or lying in the bracken, their little heads turning inquiringly towards the car as we passed. Ahead, another avenue of elm trees. Then the house itself appeared, stark grey against the blue sky, its two lead statues of loyalty and fame looking far out over the trees to the Churchill Palace at Blenheim, its neighbour to the east. Now that little quote, written by Ronnie Tree in about 1974, that's better, and more than 25 years after he had to sell the house and some 40 years after the event, I think captures really what the house meant to Ronnie. And Ronnie bought the house within 2 weeks for £30,000, lock, stock and barrel. He never even bothered to go back to look at it again. He just bought it. And I think on that first visit, it was probably this room that had captivated Ronnie. This is the Great Hall. And again, the house was by Gibbs, and it had been built for the second Earl of Lichfield. That's not the family of the late Patrick Lichfield, who died last year, the photographer. It's the first creation of the Earldom of Lichfield. And Ronnie was captivated by this room, the Great Hall, and we English were somewhat reluctant to give up our great halls. But one thing I wanted to sort of point out to you was that this was not the everyday entrance to a house. And in a way, the overexposure of such rooms to us and photography has diminished their grandeur, and that's a shame, really. The everyday entrance to Ditchley was actually on the east front. Now, when Ronnie and Nancy bought Ditchley, the historical decoration, was believed to be by William Kent, but only the pictures you see on either side of the central doorcase and the tiny fragment you can just see in the ceiling are definitely by William Kent. We know this because we've got the receipts. And they're actually scenes from the Iliad. And the Iliad had been translated in a new edition by Alexander Pope in 1725, and Kent had done the illustrations for it. The reliefs above the pictures are drawn from the Arch of Constantine in Rome, and you also see the muses lolling around on the door cases, and above them are poets on brackets. And this watercolour that I'm using here is by the Russian artist Alexander Shrebryakov, and it was done in 1948 as a record for the house. And it shows the post-war arrangement when they brought the sofas, which had hitherto been in the white drawing room. They brought them into this room, actually during the war when labour was short. And Nancy chose the colour of the wall by scraping. She scraped away the paint, and beneath numerous layers, she found this sort of green. It's an earlier colour. It's not the original colour. It's later than the 1720s. It's later. But it's a pale green, and it was like the colour of oxidised copper. And if you remember the hall at Kelmarsh, this is a similar arrangement, only they only had one fireplace, not two. But notice in the centre of the room is a desk, but this time she's using a French bureau plate, not an English pillar desk. And this time she teamed it up with an English back stool. That tall chair in red that you see there with the gilt legs is what's called an English back stool. And it's roughly the same date as the desk, and it shows the divergence in French and English furniture design at the period. Now, again, just like Kelmarsh, you walk through the Great Hall and you're into the saloon. This is the saloon, but it was probably originally intended to be the great parlour. And the function of rooms changed in a house during the 18th century, and many of them changed completely and were slightly redesigned. And the wall colour here, again, is an original colour. Nancy again attacked the wall with a paper knife, and beneath numerous layers of paint, she found this streaked ochre and orange colour, and she had it stripped back to that. When she bought the house, it was painted white, completely white, and it must have looked a little bit like an inverted wedding cake. But the exuberant plaster decoration is again original to the room, and it was by the Italian stuccadoros who worked for Gibbs. But the room is rather an odd plan, and the trees used it as a room for tea, for serving tea, or as a summer dining room when they threw open the doors to the garden. And Nancy was quite inventive in her housekeeping, and the tables that were produced at tea time were painted a brilliant Chinese lacquer red. And this was not only striking, it was also practical. She didn't need tablecloths on them, so it cut down housework. But as Deborah Devonshire has said, it was something that anybody could do, but nobody else did. And that was Nancy for you. There was only one room at Ditchley which was totally redecorated, really, and that was this, and that's the tapestry drawing room. And when the Trees bought the house, the Dillon estate, they bought the house from the estate of the Viscount Dillon, and his trustees had sold the tapestries that were in this room. And it would have been quite possible for the Trees to have gone out and bought tapestries at the estate and redone the room with tapestries, but they chose not to do so. And taking an idea from the French decorator Stéphane Boudin, they had bolts of crimson Victorian damask. They had it bleached, and it came out like an ivory colour, tinged with pink. And round about the house, they found a number of Chippendale wall appliques in the chinoiserie taste, and the mirror, which you see over the fireplace, which is by John Linnell. So Nancy played up the sort of Chinesey theme by using lots of lacquer furniture in it. And the striking thing about that room is there is not a stick of brown furniture in it. It's all painted furniture or lacquer. And that is really Nancy's mature style. Now, sometimes houses with long histories are apt to impose their taste upon any would-be decorator. And this was one such room. I hope that's in focus. No, it's not. This was the tapestry drawing room. And when the house was built, this had originally been the state bedroom. And they had bought a quantity of Genoese velvet depicting the Hindu god Shiva, the destroyer of worlds. I have become death, the destroyer of worlds, which is rather a comforting decorative motif for a bedroom. However, fortunately, state bedrooms were never really intended to be used. They were what I call swank factor. And it had a very, very heavy pattern, as you can see. And so Nancy picked up the yellow in the background, and she used that as the basis of her decoration. And she used many different sorts of yellow, different tones of yellow, but she also used many different types of fabric. So there's velvet, there's damask, etc. And you've got a patterned carpet. Now, you've got pattern everywhere. But in all that pattern, it gives the room what Nancy called, using the French word, mouvement, or movement. And it brought life, and everything blended itself together to form a restful whole. And as Nancy said, you never wanted to have only one mouvement thing in a room, like a Savonnet rug, that would stand out. You must have mouvement everywhere. And she went on to quote the Green State Bedroom at Houghton as a good example, where you have the great, very tall Queen Anne State Bed, which is by William Kent, and it's hung with apple green velvet. And Nancy said it was like a waterfall. And the wainscoting and the cornices were all bone white with gold leaf. You've got tapestries, you've got oriental rugs. And in all that movement, there is a rhythm that gives the room great tranquility. Nothing forces itself on the attention. Nothing stands out obtrusively. And that's the essence of good decorating. Nancy also respected the past. This was the white drawing room, which was through from the velvet drawing room I've just shown you. And this had originally been created as the state dining room, but the role of such rooms is rather obscure because we have no contemporary description of one in use. But anyway, it's at the opposite end of the house from the kitchens, which was eminently practical. So it was converted in 1769 into a drawing room. And this shows the changing role of a house. But the room's original decoration had played up the Earl of Lichfield's royal heritage, and he had paintings of his grandfather and his grandmother, King Charles II and Barbara Villiers. And it had a then fashionable white and gold colour scheme. And Nancy respected this. She didn't touch it. All she did was she had the paintwork washed and touched up. And white damask curtains were made for the windows, and she carried on the line of the dado rail by having a little red ruching put onto the curtaining. And that's a neat little touch. And it was the only room in the house which was furnished and then refurnished. And you see here the post-war arrangement when it had become a formal drawing room. They had another formal drawing room, which was this room, the blue drawing room. And it had a companion across the saloon, which was later incorporated into the library, which I will show you in a moment. And it was hung with blue silk, originally green silk. But when the Trees bought it, it was blue silk, but only in panels on the wall because the silk had all rotted. And again, they could have done what they wanted to the room. But they respected tradition, and the curtains were in reasonable condition, so they had the silk rewoven in Lyon and used it as a formal drawing room. It was furnished with furniture that was in the house as a small formal drawing room. The portraits that you see are by Wright of Derby. Now, one important room in the house, and I apologise profusely for the quality of this slide. This is the only known image of the dining room. And Nancy painted the dining room elephant's breath, which is a soft grey. The nearest actual representation I could say is to go and look at a beech tree, and the trunk of a beech tree is that wonderful soft grey, and that is the colour. And Sybil Colefax's dining room at Argyle House was a similar shade because she stripped off all the paint from the panelling and it left this sort of grey colour. And grey works well with yellow, so she had yellow silk damask curtains, and she brought with her the yellow, high-backed yellow leather dining chairs, which had been at Kelmarsh. And the room was lit entirely by candles, which is yellow light, and this enhanced the mood. And to quote the Duchess of Devonshire, there Nancy would sit bolt upright at the end of the dining room table on one of the high-backed yellow chairs, wearing something enviable with her own signature of a brilliant bit of colour somewhere, debunking pomposity, making a comical mountain out of an ordinary molehill, taking over the table so that people stopped talking to listen and to laugh. And that was very much Nancy's way of entertaining. That was the southern way of entertaining. She would talk up and down the table. Now, I mentioned earlier that they did make one radical alteration to the house, which, in hindsight, Nancy forever regretted. and that was this. They created a large library, and they did this by knocking two smaller rooms together. And the small drawing room, which had opened off the saloon, had a beautiful ceiling of Leader and the Swan, which Nancy was assured could be taken down, but in the event it just crumbled into dust, and she forever regretted doing it. And the bookcases you see there were designed by Boudin. But Nancy always felt that the room was just like everybody else's, and it never really got over the curse, what I call the curse of two rooms. They all sat at one end of the room. Two rooms, when you knock two rooms together, unless you're very careful, it never works. It's a silly thing to do. And Nancy felt, in this particular case, it destroyed the rhythm of the house. And she went on to say, you shouldn't destroy something just to get what you want, which is probably true, actually. All I can say is she was perhaps learning, or there's much joy in heaven at a sinner that repents. Anyway, moving along, state bedrooms, as I said, were not intended for use. They were statements of power and wealth. But this was the principal guest bedroom on the first floor, and the pediments over the door cases clearly make that abundantly clear. It's a sign of quality and a sign of expense, and none of the other bedrooms have this. And with the furniture that they had at Kelmarsh, they brought with them this bed, which had formerly been in one of the white bedroom, actually, at Kelmarsh, and they had it redressed with yellow silk. And there's a section of the old hangings now in the V&A's collection. And one thing I wanted you to note here was Nancy had a very good eye for furniture. Please note the eccentric chair near the door, made up of circles. And that's actually the English 18th century chairs, and she bought them from Edward Hudson, the owner of Country Life. When they bought the house, they also acquired 3 Polonaise beds, and this is one of them, this one had very good hangings in a Gothic chintz, which they retained. They redressed the other 2 beds. And it's an adaptation of a design by Hepplewhite. Hepplewhite published a furniture catalogue with bits and pieces in it, and you could more or less go along and mix and match. It was sort of like pick and mix. And that's what he did. And again, you will notice there are a couple of pieces of brown furniture in the room, but notice the sofa table, how the legs are X-frame, and that's, again, a mark of quality. It's unusual. It's a mark of expense. But notice in the glass, you can see there's a painted amour, which was either French or Italian, and that was more Nancy's style of furniture. And the key to the bedrooms, really, at Ditchley were the comfort of the guest. There were huge square down pillows, there were portmanteau sheets, decorated with carnations and trailing blue flowers and scalloped edges in the same colour. The eider downs were covered in pale silk, with a tiny little bow, where a stitch held the down in place. And within easy reach of the bed, you would have a carafe of fresh water, there would be books, notepaper, there'd be a vase of flowers on the chest, and perhaps a fire in the grate. And the fact that we take all of these things for granted is partly because of Nancy. This was Nancy's way of entertaining. Of course, they didn't stop, again, just in the house. They went outside into the garden, and Ronnie had a knack of finding just the right person. And they approached Geoffrey Jellicoe to help them with the garden design, a young man starting out in practice. And it was really the trees who made Jellicoe and made his reputation. And it was from doing this garden that he got the job at Royal Lodge at Windsor, working for the King and Queen. And he was then in partnership with a man called Russell Page, who had worked for Ogden Codman. As you can see, everybody seems to have known everybody else. We don't know what the brief was for the garden, for the West Garden, but part of it must have been to incorporate a pool. And the brilliantly theatrical fountains you see playing there actually conceal a swimming pool. And they were designed to conceal the bathers from the house. It's overlooked by the large drawing room, the white drawing room. And while the design was being created, there was a sale at a house called Rest Park, and Ronnie bought the parterre that you see there, the Stone Age parterre, and Russell Page loathed it. He hated it because it was so intricate, it was very difficult to plant it simply and well, and it never really looked anything, actually, until after the war, when it was planted with lavender and rosemary and things. This house made a huge impression on everybody who visited it, even though what I call its Indian summer was relatively short. It was a mere 16 years. But to the Viscountess Head, she said, I can't remember a wet or a cloudy day, and dared to think the joys of Ditchley would be eternal. And to Hal Nicholson, Vita Sackville West's husband, the great mass of the house is dark and windowless, and then a chink in the door opens, and we enter suddenly into the warmth of central heating, the blaze of lights, and the amazing beauty of the hall. The beauty of the house is beyond words. And even James Lees Milnes described it as perfection. Nothing jars, nothing is too sumptuous or too new. Nothing is too sumptuous or too new. And that was really the key to Ditchley. And as Michael Tree said to me, Nancy's son, he said, my mother liked fabrics to live a life of their own. She liked the sun to get in, she liked them to go shabby, she liked them to bleach their colour. So the house was, although it was a grand house, it didn't feel grand. In 1943, Nancy had another nervous breakdown, and she was packed off to America, to Connecticut, and she could visit beloved Mirador. And when she came home, it was quite plain to Ronnie that she needed something to occupy her mind. So he persuaded her to buy the decorating firm Colefax and Fowler in 1944, which she did. And Colefax and Fowler had been founded by Lady Colefax in 1930 or 1931. And in 1938, her business partner, Peggy Ward, the Countess of Munster, wanted to retire and advised her to take on John Fowler, which she did. And that is how Colefax and Fowler was born. Lady Colefax was a 1930s decorator, and she was much influenced by a body of people known as the Souls. And the Souls were a group of artists and bohemians who gathered around Arthur Balfour and George Nathaniel Curzon, Lord Curzon. And it was from the Souls that Sybil Colefax learned to love sort of off colours, pale greens and greys and opaque yellows. And it was from houses like Stanway in the Cotswolds, the home of Mary, Lady Weems. And Mary Weems was a Wyndham. Her parents had built Clouds. So again, the connections are all there. And Lady Colefax was really working on exactly the same lines as Nancy, but her starting point wasn't Virginia and the faded grandeur of the plantation houses. It was basically the Souls and their shabby old houses. That's where she was working from. Anyway, Ronnie's idea was brilliant. Quite whether he realised what he was unleashing on the world is another matter. But in 1947, Nancy and Ronnie were divorced. And Nancy had been carrying on an affair with Juby Lancaster, Claude Lancaster, who owned Kelmarsh Hall. And in 1948, she married him. And it was a big mistake. Never marry your affairs. It never works out. It's disaster, disaster. Anyway, and before the ink was dry on the certificate, they were communicating via their solicitors, or as you would say, their lawyers, and it just went downhill all the way. And eventually, Juby, the reality is that Nancy didn't marry old Juby. She married Kelmarsh Hall. That's the reality of it. And old Juby had the utmost difficulty in regaining his house. So if there's anybody who wants to get rid of their wife, then I can recommend a way of doing it, and that is to cut the electricity off. That's what Juby did, and it got her out. And he got the house back. And so in November 1953, she left Kelmarsh with 3 van loads of furniture at the back of her. So, all's fair in love and war. And Nancy sort of did work at the shop, but she wasn't a decorator. She would go out buying. And as you've seen, as I've pointed out to you, she had brilliant taste, and she had an instant eye for quality, unusual pieces and quality pieces that would sell in the shop. Now, having been booted out of Kelmarsh rather unceremoniously, she went house hunting. She wanted a country house. Well, she was an estate agent's worst nightmare. And she looked at something like 100 houses before she found this house, Haseley Court. And she only found that by chance because she'd no sense of direction and they turned left instead of right when looking for Tythrop. And as they drove up the drive, she said to her sons, she said, I've been here before. And they both thought, oh gosh, she's lost the plot again. But no, she had been there before. She'd been there to dinner before the war. And she distinctly remembered a staircase that was quaint but architecturally wrong. And she remembered in the drawing room a long, low table full of blue and white china. There was the staircase. When they opened the door, nobody stopped them. There was the staircase, architecturally wrong but quaint. And there was the table minus the china. And Haseley Court, this is the west front, but unlike Kelmarsh and Ditchley, it was a small manor house built for a gentleman, and it's actually of slightly earlier date. It's 1704 to 1710, so it's Queen Anne, it's not Georgian. And it was in a terrible state. And as Nancy said, and I quote, I wanted a house that hadn't been touched or modernised. There wasn't a bathroom in it. The roof was off. They'd stolen the tiles. It didn't have heat. It didn't have electricity. It was just what I wanted. So there you go. No accounting for taste. She bought it for her old age, thinking she had 15 years to live. And this was in 1954. She was 57. And she actually lived for another 40 years. And she bought the house and 80 acres of land for £4,000. I know. But you haven't heard the best bit yet. And she got the rampant dry rot and wet rot came for free. Now, from the west front, Haseley must have seemed like a massive house, but actually it's just one room deep. And Nancy's sons, Michael and Jeremy Tree, must have been overjoyed to discover this. Well, the joy was short-lived, because it would have cost between £12,000 and £15,000 to restore the house. It would have been cheaper to have demolished it and started from scratch. But Nancy, when she started to decorate and modernise the house, she had one overriding objective, and that was this. She wanted it to be bright and light. Bright and light. And she said it over and over and over again. That's what she wanted. She wanted a house that was bright and light. And what she was seeking to do was have a house that had a nice, comfortable environment. And to Imogen Taylor, who was John Fowler's assistant, who was caught up in this creative whirlwind, it was wonderful to be in the concept of such a house with such pretty things to go into it. She had things from Mirador. She had the 3 van loads of gear that she'd walked away with from Kelmarsh, and she was able to buy some bits and pieces from Ditchley. And to all of this, she added her 3 tricks, which were real fires, candlelight, and masses of flowers. But it was a nightmare working for Nancy and John Fowler. And poor old Imogen swore that she'd never work for Nancy again because Nancy and John argued all the time. Nancy changed her mind all the time and was just generally impossible. But when it was all over, the whole thing was soon forgot because of the interiors that I'm going to show you. Now, unlike Kelmarsh and Ditchley, it didn't have a grand hall. It just had this small single-storey hall. And it was paved. There was a Palladian chimney piece, which is actually far too large for the room. And Nancy kept it sparsely furnished as a hall. There were just a couple of chairs in it. And she brought the red curtains, or she had them copied. I think she actually brought them from Ditchley and just had them cut down. Those were the curtains that were in the hall at Ditchley. Now, the house is not a consistent whole. It had 2 wings added. And this is the first of them. This is the saloon at Haseley. I hope you can see that picture. These pictures are by Horst, and Horst used natural light to take his pictures, and the colours are absolutely superb on them. They're fantastic, but you've got to get the light right in a room for projection. And this is the saloon, which was in the neoclassical taste, and it was added in 1754. And the decoration is said to be by James Wyatt, who was then working at Oxford, and ironically, he also worked at Kelmarsh a little bit later, and he did the plaster decoration that you see in the saloon at Kelmarsh. And she decorated the room, again, using a theme of blue. And part of the reason for this was she acquired the blue drawing room curtains from Ditchley. So she lined the walls with aquamarine silk edged with a gold fillet. But the ceiling was painted in Ditchley white and the medallions in blue and part golded in 2 tones of gold. But the ceiling was restored with the utmost care. It wasn't Nancy. She restored the ceiling. And she also brought the chinoiserie carvings that you saw, which are said to be by Chippendale. And trotting past Sotheby's or Christie's one day, she popped in to see a sale that they were previewing. And she saw 2 Jacobean portraits of the Fitton sisters, Anne and Mary Fitton, and she left a bid on them, and she got them. John Fowler was appalled, but she said they were as good as Goya's. And Mary Fitton is said to be the dark lady of Shakespeare's sonnets, and she had I believe she had an affair with the Earl of Pembroke, and she ended up in the Tower. Queen Elizabeth I sent her to the Tower, because she ended up pregnant. And that was a no-no with a lady in waiting. But in the picture here, you can see on the left-hand margin, you can just see the table that I talked about, the long table there, which Nancy attacked with a penny, and scraping away, she found that beneath it was blue and white. So this may also have played a part in the decoration. And other things were of the finest quality. The Waterford chandelier you see there, 30-pound chandelier, is considered amongst the finest ever made. Now, in the older part of the house, the original part of the house, was the dining room. Nancy wanted a less formal dining room than before. So she painted the room biscuit, a colour she called biscuit, which was copying the colour that had been at Mirador in the dining room there. And from a house at Broughton-on-the-Hill, she bought some old Regency leather dining chairs where the leather was splitting and peeling, but she just left it as it was. The house had belonged to a Miss Bligh, who was a descendant of Captain Bligh of Mutiny on the Bounty fame. And instead of having a DN diner or a pedestal diner, she chose a large oval fruitwood table, what's commonly called a wake table. But the thing I wanted to point out here, the particular point of this slide, is notice the wing chairs used as carvers with their slip chintz covers. And that's very unusual. I cannot remember a house of the same date where you see that. And that was Nancy's way of bringing informality into the dining room. Now, I mentioned the library at Mirador, and I said it was a very American room. Well, the library at Haseley was in the Gothic taste, and it was again it was an addition to the house which had been added in 1766. But it shows in a way how Nancy has matured as a decorator. And you remember the library at Mirador and how formal it was, and it was rather dark and gloomy. The one at Kelmarsh was perhaps a little bit similar, and the one at Ditchley was rather grand but didn't work because of the 2-room syndrome. But here you get a pure English library. Notice all the clutter around, the books, magazines, that's an English library. And from Ditchley she brought the curtains, which had once been green but had faded to a sort of no colour, a bit like tobacco. And the false valances eked out the material. And on the floor she acquired a red Brussels weave carpet with the roses and ribbons. And that came from Ashburnham Place, from the sale there. And to get it, she even outbid her own sister. So she also, from Ashburnham Place, she bought this bed. And from somewhere, we don't know where, she bought a quantity of hand-blocked old French wallpaper by Duff of depicting the romantic story of Paulette Virginian, which was a really suitable thing to have in a house owned by a Virginian. And she bought this small bed from Ashburnham and the carpet. And the bed is a very attractive four-poster, actually. You can see it today at Point of Honour at Lynchburg. And it's hung with white cotton piqué, edged with a very pretty mimosa fringe. But this is a wonderfully mellow room. This is a fantastic room, actually. Now, speaking of fantastic rooms, John and Nancy created 2 quite remarkable rooms. And this is the first of them. This is what's called the Gothic Bedroom, and it was in the medieval part of the house at Haseley. And it's a huge room. It's 46 feet by 17. And when Nancy bought the house, it had been panelled, but dry rot destroyed all the panelling, so the panelling was all stripped out. And she copied from the blue drawing room at St Michael's Mount near Penzance the cornice, the pendant cornice that you see there. The rest of what you see there is not plaster, it's trompe-l'oeil, it's paint. And Nancy gave instructions for this to be done, and she trotted over here to Virginia. When she came back, she was furious. As she looked at it, she said, "Damn, John, it's stucco and not trompe-l'oeil." Well, no, it's not, actually. It's trompe-l'oeil. It's all paint, except the cornice that you see. The only criticism she actually had of it was over the fireplace, they painted a Diana, and she criticised their knowledge of women's anatomy, and she always threatened to expose herself to teach them a lesson. But as George Oakes was unmarried at the time, and John was gay, one marvels at their knowledge of women's anatomy. Anyway, as you have that sort of wonderful sort of orange pumpkin-y shade, and a good contrast to that is blue. So the bathroom overlooking the forecourt was done in blue with a fantastic octifoil window. And this is a typical Nancy bathroom, and it was arranged like a small sitting room. And again, quoting the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire, the bathrooms at Ditchley, she said they were like little works of art. She said they were warm-panelled and carpeted, and there were shelves with Chelsea china cauliflowers and cabbages and tulips and little rabbits of exquisite quality. And she said it was a far cry from the cracked lino and the icy draughts which were often the norm, or all the tiled monstrosities that we unfortunately suffer, which are reminiscent of a mortuary. But not Nancy. She had little sitting room bathrooms, and they're fabulous. Now, over the saloon, which I showed you earlier, if I can get this thing to change, there we go, was the south bedroom. And this was actually, when she actually decorated the house, the idea of the Gothic bedroom was for her aunt, Lady Astor. But Lady Astor didn't like it. It was too big, and it was too far away from her maid. And so she took this bedroom, the south bedroom, over the saloon, which had a small dressing room next door where her maid could sleep. And if I can get it into focus. No. There we go. Voila. That's better, isn't it? Anyway. What I wanted to point out here was that if you notice, the curtains at the windows, they have blinds. And that's because the windows had very, very deep heads. And all the space that you see where the blind is all wall. So that was a way of altering the proportions of the room, which is what they did. And again, she bought the bed came from Kimbleton with its fluted pilaster posts, and it was hung with green silk taffeta. And these rooms that I've tried to show you very quickly made a huge impression on people. And even the photographer Horst, who took all the colour pictures that I've showed you, was impressed. And he said, with her unsurpassed sense of style, Mrs. Lancaster emphasised its elegance, made it even more beautiful, even grander yet, if possible, even more congenial than the ideal, comfortable English country house of everybody's dreams. So that was high praise. Well, alas, all good things must come to an end. I haven't quite done yet. But in 1971, there was a disastrous fire which destroyed this room and the saloon below. And it was quite plain that Nancy couldn't afford to live in this house any longer. And so she moved across the forecourt to the coach house. She was 74. And it was a very courageous thing to do, because parting with something you love is never easy, and Nancy really did love Haseley. And she moved into the coach house, which, to use a quote of Harold Nicholson's, is a singularly undesirable little residence. It was terrible. It has a terrible floor pan. It's very badly laid out. And as Nancy said, she'd done it. She converted it out of a cart house so that she would have somewhere to stay when she went up to Haseley when the work was being done originally. And she said, had I known I would have ended up living there, I would have done it differently. Well, indeed. And usually I say at this point, who lives in a Palladian house? And usually nobody says I do. So the point is that all the rooms I've shown you up to press have been very grand, very architectural rooms. These rooms, these rooms that I will show you in a moment, are not. They are very, very similar to the rooms that you would find in a modern house, perhaps in an apartment here in Boston, certainly in houses that are built in England now. They are very similar to this. And the rooms show really how adaptable Nancy was and how her ideas can be adapted for us, which I think is very important. And here you see the sitting room. And as the sitting room had no cornice, they added a blue band of paper all along the edge, which they carried down to the floor, which you can see there. What you can't see on the picture is that on the carpet they sewed a broad band of blue onto the carpet, about a foot wide, and that anchored the room. So the room had a bit of structure and anchor. The dining room was even worse, because the dining room is basically a thoroughfare into the sitting room, as you can see. It's a really awkward little room, and it's only 14'6" by 9'9", and it's almost the same proportions as my own dining room, but it's treated far more elegantly. And again, to give it some structure, they used trompe-l'oeil panelling, painted in blue and grey on a creamy white ground. And the whole thing is on a diminutive scale. Note again the use of small carvers, small armchairs as carvers, and it has a small chintz pattern. I think it's actually sea coral, an old Colefax pattern. And Nancy used that actually as the lining fabric for the curtains, copying an idea from the Duchess of Windsor. She used the plain white lining into the room, and she put the pattern out and onto the window. Now, she needed a little bit more space, and so she created a library in the orangery. When she bought the house, there we go. That's better, isn't it? Yeah. When she bought the house, it had two little buildings in the forecourt, the kitchen forecourt, and to which she added a third to make a little Palladian group. And she turned this one into her library. She did actually think of turning the whole thing into a house, but she decided against it because she liked to look at them. And that was a mistake, because it would have made a fantastic little house, actually. And it was a shame she didn't do it. And from the old library at Haseley, she brought her books, and much the same furniture, really. And the pale sofa that you see there came from the sitting room at Queen Anne's Gate. And here's a nice little corner detail in the library, with the festoon blinds from Ditchley, reused. Probably green silk, but I think they'd then been dyed brown. And notice the green chair, which is a perfect accompaniment to it. But notice in the picture how nothing is forcing itself on your eye. It all turns together beautifully. And that's the essence of good decorating. Nancy's bedroom was created during the days of Laura Ashley. We all remember Laura Ashley and how everybody had those little patterns. Now, this isn't a Laura Ashley print. It was actually a Colefax fabric called Angeline. It was French. And Sybil Connolly, a friend of Nancy's, had it copied and printed onto linen for her so she could have a bed corona. But again, note how she sort of picks an idea from her own times and reuses it. And notice also how there really isn't much brown furniture in the room. And also, it's not got anything of great monetary value. None of these rooms have. It's all quite sort of ordinary, run-of-the-mill stuff. There are little silhouettes which you could probably pick up for £50 ago and things like that. So there's nothing very valuable in the whole house. This is a sort of bit of a riot, this room, really. This was the guest bedroom. The beds are French. She bought them in France. And the paper is actually American. It's something you created. So you've got a rare example of Franco-American cooperation. Don't worry, it doesn't last. But notice that she used pattern everywhere. The whole thing is pattern. You're saturated with pattern. And by doing this, she made the room appear larger than it actually was. And notice the way she's cleverly dressed the windows. And you will also notice there's barely any brown furniture in the room. There's a diminutive chest between the windows, and that's about it. And notice also how the footstools, the green, highlights all the colours. And this sense of style went out onto the terrace as well, using these wonderful chairs, painted Confederate grey. Everything in the garden at Haseley was painted Confederate grey. And Nancy also flew the Southern Cross from the house staff, just to sort of underline the point. And the yellow tree that you see is a robinia, but I'm not sure that it's actually hardy here. Now, I mentioned that Nancy had bought Colefax and Fowler. Well, John Fowler was a brilliant decorator, as you will discover next year when my book comes out. But he was a useless businessman. He was absolutely hopeless. And the shop lost money virtually every year. And I remember Imogen Taylor telling me that Nancy was furious one year because she said, "I've lost £180 this year," which is what, about $300? $350. Well, poor old Imogen was only paid $120 a year. So that shows you how much money she was losing. But anyway, something had to be done. And in 1958, Colefax rented the ground floor of 39 Brook Street to Barclays Bank, and Nancy took over a large chunk of the upstairs of 39A to form an apartment, and she gave up her house in Charles Street. And what is known as the Avery Row flat, it was approached from a side door on Avery Row, which was not the most salubrious address in London. And most of it was on the first floor. And this is Nancy's bedroom, which was at the top of the stairs. You went up a small back staircase, which they marbleized. They painted it and marbleized it. And it was a bit like entering a Venetian palazzo. And at the top of the stairs was her bedroom, which again, to give it a bit of structure, they trompe-l'oeil panelled. And notice again, there isn't any brown furniture in the room. There is a fantastic lacquer secretaire there, but that's the finest piece of furniture in that room. And that, from the small vestibule there, it opened into this room. And as I mentioned, Nancy and John created two fantastic rooms, and this is the second one of them. And this is the famous yellow room, and it's become rightly famous. It's a tour de force in decorating, and it's one of the finest rooms created in the post-war period. Now, ironically, it's almost the same size as the Gothic bedroom I showed you a moment ago. It's 46 feet by 16. And it's not a terribly light room, funnily enough, although there are 3 sets of windows. And note again, it's all painted furniture. The bookcases came from Ashburnham and were cut down. The dwarf ones came from Chiswick House. And the dining table was the twin of the one used in the coach house dining room that you saw a moment ago. Brown furniture actually kills the effect. And the chandeliers in white glass were made in Murano to a design of John's. And although it might appear a highly theatrical sort of room, it's also an eminently practical one. And it's also very clever, because it's part office, it's part dining room, it's part sitting room and library. And the fact that you can mix all these functions together skillfully shows the underlying cleverness of the basic plan. Now, the idea came from for the colour, came from many sources. And I wanted to show you this slide here. Now, in the left-hand margin, the photographer, James Mortimer, when he took these pictures, he used a flash. And I'm glad he did, because the flash you can see reflected in the wall on the left-hand side. And that shows you the glossiness of the finish. And this idea of using yellow, Nancy had a yellow sitting room at Queen Anne's Gate. And that might have been part of the idea. We don't really know. But the actual finish of it, that's quite interesting. And I recently did an interview with an old colleague of John's. And he recalled going to a Georgian house. Maddeningly, he can't remember where. But he said he remembered seeing a red and a green lacquered room. And it was about the same time this room was created. And when he told John Fowler this and rhapsodized about it, John Fowler's reply was quite simple and very interesting. It was this: "Must have been Mrs. Bethel, childie, Mrs. Bethel." So the idea for the finish of this room probably came from Ethel Bethel. And I know I love saying that, it's great, isn't it? The room was actually painted many times. If anybody in the room is a decorator, you can't get away with painting a room 9 times. Your client would have a nervous breakdown. But that's basically what was done here. It was painted a number of times, which built up the colour, and then it was glazed. And John tinted and played around, he messed around with the glazes so much that it's proved impossible for Colefax and Fowler to reproduce it, and they've had 2 goes at it. The first time it was like a primrose yellow. It was redone 2 years ago, and although it's not far off, it's not quite right. It still haven't got the depth of colour that John had in it. So even the curtains played a part in the room. And if I can get it to change, there we go, voila. And these were just dress curtains. And the central window was kept relatively simply dressed, but the two outer windows were given these elaborate dress curtains of unlined yellow shantung silk, which was hung from gilded rods with rope and tassels, which you can see there. And they were pulled back to give the impression of Italian stringing, but they're not, actually. But the whole room is really the very apotheosis of Nancy and John Fowler's style and taste. And it's really Nancy and John at their grandest. And Nancy had the reputation, I think, personally, well-deserved, of having the finest taste of... Is that in focus? Yes. No? How's that? No? That better? There you go. How's that? Yeah. Anyway, Nancy had the reputation of having the best taste of almost anybody in the world, and she tried to create a look of studied carelessness. That was the phrase that she used to Bill Paley, the former chairman of CBS. And to Cecil Beaton, she had a real talent for sprucing up a stately but a shabby house and making a grand house appear less grand. And she did this by having, as he said, an adequate reverence for tradition, and she observed all the rules of style and proportion. But she manifested a healthy disregard for the sanctity of important furniture. And you've sat here very patiently for an hour listening to me drone on about Nancy Lancaster as a decorator. Well, now I'm going to contradict everything I've said. Nancy wasn't a decorator. She never claimed to be a decorator, and she wasn't a decorator. And as she said, I'm agin decorating. I'm a percolator of ideas. And that's what Nancy was. She was a percolator of ideas. And it's the way that percolator, it's the way that she brewed that brew that was important. And that is the point about Nancy. And Nancy said she recognised that she'd lived a very privileged life, really. And she said how lucky I'd been to live in such beautiful places. And I've been able to make them as I've dreamed, and I've been very lucky. I've adored my houses more than my friends or husbands. That's not actually true, certainly not the friend bit. I'm not sure about the husband, but anyway. Anyway, she said, I've no regrets. I could not have enjoyed it more. It's like the end of a party. Well, she was wrong, because the party continues for all who knew her. And for all of us, evidence that you have trailed out tonight to hear me is proof of that. And I was brought up to believe that the world should always be a better place because a man hath lived. Well, I think it's a better place, I think it's a richer place, and I think it's a far more beautiful place because of Nancy Lancaster. Thank you very much for coming. I don't know if there's anybody who wants to ask any questions, but I'll be around anyway if anybody does. Okay?